pleasure for me to introduce Ralph Cavanaugh today. It would really be hard to find a more fitting speaker for Earth Day. Cavanaugh has been staff attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council for the past 15 years. He has written extensively on environmental and energy issues. He's lectured on those issues at both Harvard and Stanford law schools, and he has been the recipient of numerous environmental awards. Not only that, but he's a great speaker. He was former director of debate and public speaking at Yale. He assures me that he had no hand in doing any of the public speaking training for George Bush. Perhaps most important to those of us in the Pacific Northwest, he has been instrumental in a number of initiatives that have furthered an environmental agenda in this region, particularly in the energy arena. Increased energy conservation, utilities' widespread use of integrated resource planning, which assures that environmental values will be considered in energy planning, and the resurgence of wind power in the Pacific Northwest. Ralph's deft hand is behind all of these. Now, that hand is usually in a velvet glove, but occasionally it can be found holding a hammer. That's because Ralph cares very deeply about what he does, but he also understands the importance of negotiating and working with potential opponents to create those win-win situations that we all strive for. Although those of us in the energy business do not always agree with Ralph, he is universally respected. I assure you that when Ralph Cavanaugh speaks, we all listen very closely. Please join me in listening closely as Ralph talks about envisioning a sustainable future for the Pacific Northwest.
Well, now I have to begin with a confession, which is that I have been eagerly waiting to give this speech for 15 years. Back in 1979, I accepted the best job in the national environmental movement, which is director of the Northwest Environmental Projects of the Natural Resources Defense Council. Now, I should acknowledge that at that time, the director was also the technical staff, the media coordinator, and the principal source of administrative support. But I want to tell you that quite literally the first thing that I read when I walked into the office was a speech by a redoubtable Oregonian, known to many of you, named Donald Hodel, to the Portland City Club. And the speech was entitled "The Prophets of Shortage." That's prophets like in the Old Testament. And Mr. Hodel's thesis, both powerfully and cogently delivered, as you all know he can do, was that, and I quote, "The environmental movement has fallen into the hands of a small and arrogant faction which is dedicated to bringing our society to a halt." That was one of the speech's less vivid passages. And for reasons that I'll get to in just a moment, Don Hodel was very unhappy with the Natural Resources Defense Council and its allies among the region's environmental groups. And I've been waiting ever since to set the record straight. Now, of course, people have been known to respond very unproductively and very unexpectedly to long-awaited opportunities to address an audience that mattered a lot to them. I have in mind the story of Conrad Hilton, who, after a very long and exhausting career of hotel management, finally got his invitation to appear on The Tonight Show. And Johnny Carson welcomed him on the set, and he turned to the cameras and said, "Well, Mr. Hilton, what do you have to say to the American people?" And Mr. Hilton peered back into the camera and said, "I do wish that more of you would remember to leave the shower curtain inside the bathtub." Now, my aspirations for all of you go considerably further this afternoon. And I think in setting them out, I need to begin by acknowledging that the Natural Resources Defense Council has a decided weakness for Oregon and Oregonians. Nominally, we are a national organization with an international agenda. But the discerning observer would note that 4 of our founders were natives of this state, one of them named Stoll, and that our first regional project focused on the Northwest and that it continues to do so more than 2 decades later, and most of that time under the same management. And then in a host of other ways, I'll acknowledge here, although nowhere else, we do betray some indisputable regional prejudices. And occasionally people wonder why. Even people from NRDC's headquarters, where the nearest Columbia is on the corner of 116th and Broadway. So I thought a word of explanation was in order, and of course our regional prejudice cannot be explained by simply observing that this place is simply magnificent. That claim is made from time to time in shameless disregard of abundant historical evidence to the contrary. Timothy Egan reminds us that in the early 19th century, The Federal Administration commissioned an expert evaluation of the Pacific Northwest by real estate appraisers, and its official conclusion, which was published without recorded dissent, is that, and here I quote again, the country north and west of the Columbia, extending north to the 49th latitude and west to the sea, is extremely worthless. End of quote. Without pausing to debate the merits of this view at any length, I will contend, and it is my principal theme today, and Isaac has done a good job of foreshadowing it, that the Pacific Northwest is uniquely promising as a potential model for what many of us call sustainable development. Now, that's a much abused term. I have in mind something that I think is pretty straightforward, both substantively and ethically. It is meeting the needs of this generation without compromising the welfare of those who follow. My optimism about the Northwest stems in part from the fact that I think it's the best hope for the regional governance and the regional stewardship that we need everywhere in a world whose rivers and forests and airsheds and species stubbornly refuse to respect state boundaries. Several things drive that conclusion about why I think the Northwest can do that. You begin with a tradition of state and local innovation and risk-taking in environmental policy. This is one of the few places on Earth where the fact that something hasn't been tried is an attraction as opposed to an obstacle among many of the decision makers. We have a base here of publicly accessible institutions that are at least capable of acting in the interests of the regional environment. And we have experience with environment-driven structural change in the Northwest that is by any definition, I think, fundamental. And finally, I'd suggest that we have a number of immediate opportunities to transform deteriorating situations into positive precedents with global significance. And I don't know of any other region that has all of that. And I'll now try to meet briefly my burden of explaining to you, and I doubt that it's much of a burden in this audience, why I think the Northwest fits all of those descriptions. I spoke first of the tradition of environmental innovation here. And in that, I need to tell you, my rule of thumb is that everything California takes credit for was done first in the Pacific Northwest. California environmentalists, when pressed, for example, will acknowledge how then Governor Jerry Brown went about designing a pioneering program of environmental innovation back in the 1970s. The first thing he did was to go to advice to then Governor Tom McCall of Oregon and his staff. And that has also been the pattern for land use reform and recycling initiatives. The California utilities are quite properly proud of their progress in energy efficiency investment, but let's never forget that the first such program appeared in Oregon back in 1978, or that it is Washington State that has the Western utility with the largest such effort underway in relative terms, or that the first formal cooperative agreement between utilities and environmental groups to work together on sustainable energy projects was negotiated in Montana by some of Isaac's colleagues. That model is now, of course, common throughout the country. It is not accidental, moreover, I'd submit, that Seattle and Portland are on every list of potential mass transit success stories, or that in water quality management, all eyes are on the ambitious regional efforts underway throughout the Puget Sound. And before I extend that list any further, I want to make clear that I'm not embracing a utopian fantasy. I will acknowledge in a very straightforward way that the Northwest also has some of the dumbest and most destructive resource policies and some of the least enlightened resource managers anywhere on Earth. But I think all of them increasingly are recognized as anachronisms, not role models. And I think that the anachronisms confront not just the hope, but the reality of past environmental victories that are fundamental by almost any measure. Take any of the precedents that I've touched upon, and you're going to find a happy confluence of resourceful Northwest environmentalists and accessible institutions, both public and private. Now, mind you, I said accessible. That's open to persuasion. It doesn't mean converted. But that's a terrific improvement on places like, say, Washington, D.C., with its 23,000 registered lobbyists, its 1,300 corporate offices, its 3,500 trade associations. The Pacific Northwest is among the very best refutations of that tired old claim that the states are the places where you swat the mosquitoes, and if you want to drain the swamp, you go to Washington, D.C. Let's put that one behind us, and let's use this as an example for why we can do that. Now, I want to offer as a very specific illustration of why we should put that metaphor aside for all time, a transformation that I witnessed almost from the beginning with many in this room, through which a great many Northwesterners showed all of us how to aspire for more than just incremental social change in our time. And the best way I know to begin the story is to quote from a speech again that may sound quite contemporary to some of you. So let me begin. These are not my words, as I think will become fairly quickly apparent. I've become deeply concerned about the future of the environmental movement. What began as a responsible, needed guardian of our natural resources has become something quite different. It is no longer just a conservation movement, but a crusade to stop all development in this country. The people of this country will not give up their standard of living because someone else tells them that the Spartan life is the good life. They will not forego their own aspirations to pay for someone else's nostalgic quest for Walden Pond. And then continuing, I believe that the vast majority of our citizens have a balanced concern about jobs, economic stability, and a healthy environment. As such, they should be aware of the utter unwillingness of the environmental movement to accept any responsibility for the chaos which could result from their actions. Nor does the environmental extremist have any constructive alternative to propose in place of those energy projects he opposes. He is essentially a negativist, a spoiler rather than the defender he purports to be. The author of these conciliatory remarks was, of course, Donald Hodel, and the forum was that 1975 address to all of you. Now, I want to emphasize in fairness that Hodel held absolutely no monopoly over incendiary rhetoric. As you'd realize if you'd read our direct mail pieces around the same time, asked, incidentally, around that time to define environmentalists' preferred source of electricity for the decades ahead, one of our leaders' response was flashlight batteries, as reported at any rate by John McPhee. Now, at the time he gave that speech to the City Club, Hodel was in his role as the administrator of the Bonneville Power Administration. And then as now, BPA served as the power wholesaler for the entire region. Then as now, by the way, people were wrong when they said that the Northwest was anywhere a salmon could get to. In fact, the Northwest was and remains anywhere a BPA transmission engineer can get to. Federal dams long since closed off much of the region to the salmon. In this and other speeches, Hodel was looking out 20 years to the mid-1990s, and he was describing a construction program that contemplated the completion by 1995 of 33 nuclear and coal-fired power plants. That, in turn, was a response to official utility forecasts that showed large annual power shortages, even with the construction program. And one of Don's favorite quotations was Adlai Stevenson to the effect that most people can't see the handwriting on the wall until their backs are up against it. His proposals built on a very strong coal and nuclear engineering base within the region, and initially both public and private sectors provided almost unanimous support. And I think now this is the story which allows me to begin the response by example more really than word to the speech. The Hodel vision never happened. In the end, as you know, the region actually walked away from 9 nuclear plants and 2 coal-fired power plants that had absorbed more than $7 billion in construction funds, but were never finished because better alternatives appeared. And most of the other plants in Hodel's original list of 33 never moved off the drawing board. Again, the region walked away largely because the region conceived and developed better alternatives, a task that involved a number of you here, working through institutions and organizations that crossed the physical boundaries. Now, dominating those alternatives, that better vision that emerged to supplant Hodel's, were improvements in energy efficiency, which here in the Northwest, for the first time, although certainly not the last, were established as energy resources in their own right. The fundamental idea of legislation passed back in 1980, which many of you remember, fundamental idea behind the whole conservation surge in the region was that before you invest in a new power plant or sign a contract to buy more electricity, you ought to look to see if there are cheaper alternatives to save an equivalent amount of power. A very straightforward proposition that then and now has a good deal of common sense associated with it, along with its obvious environmental importance. You should be upgrading industrial production lines, changing out commercial lighting, insulating houses if it's cheaper to do that. If it's cheaper to do that than building a power plant or signing a power purchase contract, go out and pay people to save the energy, even as you would otherwise have to go out and pay people to build the power facilities. And the Congress in the Regional Power Act in 1980 was careful to apply that principle specifically to Don Hodel's Bonneville Power Administration, the agency that sells half the electricity used in the region. And the last 14 years really has been a wonderful process of watching that work. I remember in the early days there was a particular concern that we wouldn't be able to get, while it sounded all very well in theory, pay people to conserve as an alternative to paying people to produce, but could we convince people, even with an incentive program in large numbers, to participate in these programs? And that was an issue that had us very much bogged down at the beginning, and it turned out to be very critical that Tom Stoll, who's sitting up at the front table here, knew Don Frisbee, who is, I think, well known to many of you. And Tom was successful in building the bridge between the environmental and utility communities that made it possible for us to say, hey, let's answer this question together. Let's test it. Let's not argue about it in the abstract. Let's find a Northwest community and give it a try. And to its enduring credit, Pacific Power and the Hood River Electric Co-op went off to a typical Northwest community, which turned out to be Hood River, Oregon, a community many of you know well. And over a 2-year period, through some of the most masterful marketing that I've ever seen, basically enrolled more than 85%, the entire population of a self-contained community in what was then the most ambitious conservation program in the residential sector that had ever been undertaken. And what that did was to help us all resolve our collective insecurity and uncertainty about whether, in fact, if we really tried, we could get everybody to do this. And that was, I think, an early example of the kind of extraordinary creativity and the very successful partnerships that Isaac was referring to. And it's part of Tom's legacy to you. One of the other, we've gotten much more creative in more recent years, by the way, I think, than that, and a more recent Earth Day present to all of you from the Bonneville Power Administration, the Portland General Electric Company, and Pacific Corp, is going to be the new refrigerator technology that's going to be showing up in your appliance stores in the next few days. It's more or less gotten here for Earth Day. And what these institutions did was to simply offer to pay a bounty to the appliance industry if it could come up with a refrigerator that used dramatically less electricity than any previously manufactured while simultaneously getting the chlorofluorocarbons out. Because there had been, again, a national controversy over whether we could meet our obligations under the treaty to get rid of the ozone-depleting chemicals, which are important as part of the insulation and the fluid that helps cool refrigerators. How are we going to get rid of that fluid? How are we going to change out that chemical and at the same time hold down the electricity consumption of what is the most electricity-intensive appliance in most of your homes? And because of this challenge from the utilities, this willingness to pay to save it if it was cheaper than producing it, you will basically have a product that 2 years ago no one thought could be built in the showrooms of the Northwest in the next few weeks. And as more of them proliferate, all of you ultimately, I'm confident, will have this technology installed in your homes, and ultimately people from a great many other regions and other countries will have it. And that's another illustration, I think, of the sort of thing that we're talking about here. Now, 10 years ago, when we discussed these possibilities and when Tom and Don Frisbee were designing that experiment, we were talking about ideas, we were talking about experiments. Today we have a record. We don't have to be discussing the abstractions. We have 10 years of effort, and we can talk about what's been achieved. 3 months ago, I was delighted to receive in the mail a press release from the Bonneville Power Administration whose headline is, "Conservation Targets Exceeded in 1993." And what that press release is reporting is an all-time record achievement by Bonneville in terms of savings achieved in 1993. Which to my knowledge is, by the way, the largest energy saving record for 1 year ever recorded by any American institution, or for that matter, an institution abroad. Since 1981, Bonneville announced it had saved the equivalent of 2 large coal-fired power plants in terms of electricity at less than half the cost. And Bonneville is today the second largest conservation investor in the United States, trailing only the much larger Pacific Gas and Electric Company in California. And yet, sadly, and this is a moment where I need to engage all of you because we have a challenge, we can't just declare a happy ending on this point because we have an immediate issue that really we need to talk about as a region and resolve as a region. Randy Hardy, BPA's current administrator, appeared before you on April 1st, a date almost as rich in symbolism as Earth Day. But he had a very serious message for you. And part of that message was that he's trying to reinvent Bonneville, make it more responsive, more efficient, enable it to deal with the new electricity markets of the 90s, and I think we should all support him in that, and I think he's absolutely right to be doing that. But he also told you about some of the pressures that are on him, and I want to enlarge a little bit about one particular source of pressure, to stop investing in conservation. And I think that there's one basic reason why he is under that pressure. It's important to understand Bonneville sells power directly to 100-odd utilities, a dozen-odd big industrial customers. Every one of those customers, every one of those institutions, because Bonneville doesn't sell directly to all of you, it sells to the utilities that then sell to you. But every single Bonneville customer pays into what amounts to a regional conservation fund under the system we've got today. And then your capacity to draw on that fund, if you're a Bonneville customer, depends on how much conservation you can achieve within your utility system or your industry. And that requires both entrepreneurial spirit and a commitment to save energy. And those are qualities not uniformly distributed across the utilities and industries that Bonneville serves. So like any good competitive system, this is one under which there are winners and losers, but it's a race, I submit, that benefits the entire region. It's not surprising that some of the losers want to suspend the conservation competition. But I hope and believe that Bonneville will refuse, after a conversation that I hope will include many of you. My optimism stems from the fact that Bonneville has maybe 120 direct customers, as I've mentioned, the utilities, the large industries, and they're important, and they're divided on this question, and we need to listen to their concerns, and we need to try to react to them. But Bonneville has another constituency, at least as important as the 120 customers, and that is the 9 million constituents who, in fact, use the electricity of the region and the services that it provides, or as my colleagues at the Northwest Conservation Act Coalition call you all, Bonneville's shareholders. And it's my belief that the 9 million Bonneville shareholders are not divided on this question, that they overwhelmingly endorse the principle that our regional power system should invest in electricity savings, again, wherever that's cheaper than adding more electricity. That test is always there. This is not some kind of a social welfare program. This is an effort to minimize the cost of energy service to the region and to bring the environmental benefits along as a dividend. I note that the League of Women Voters of Oregon and Washington, along with the Northwest Conservation Act Coalition, will be convening the first official BPA shareholders meeting on June 18th right here in Portland. I hope that that results in a reaffirmation of some of these same principles I've been discussing. I'm rather confident that it will. And I know Sarah Patton from NCAC is here if any of you want to talk to her about that meeting. But I think Earth Day is a particularly important moment to remind us why that principle is so important, the principle of unleashing our utilities as instruments to find and deliver the energy savings that are less costly than the alternatives. It's important in part, and I'll just cite one reason very briefly now, because of the global climate challenge that we all face, because of what we know about the increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We don't know for certain the results of that, but I think all things considered, we could get broad agreement that this is an experiment in atmospheric chemistry that none of us authorized and that all of us would like to suspend if we could. And part of the effort to suspend it and what the world and the nation so urgently need right now are very compelling, down-to-earth, practical, and yes, profitable alternatives to burning more fossil fuels to meeting our energy needs. And Bonneville has become an absolutely critical symbol, not just in this region but beyond it, for how to do that well and for a continued commitment to doing it well. And we need that. Now, in thinking about my theme of sustainable development, I've used Bonneville and the regional power system as extended illustrations of the sustainable development challenge that the region faces. And there are, of course, many others, and I want to touch very briefly on just a couple. I want to urge us all to look to the forests, where the battle for Northwest old growth became the dominant environmental metaphor of the last presidential campaign and perhaps the greatest obstacle abroad to potential U.S. leadership on biodiversity issues. Conservationist David Suzuki worries that in 30 years, there will be no wilderness left anywhere on Earth. It is here that we must begin proving him wrong. And I want to urge you to look to the rivers, where heroic efforts are underway to reconcile the competing claims of what was once the continent's greatest salmon fishery, what is now the nation's largest hydropower system, and what will forever be remembered as the world's most lavishly subsidized irrigation projects. I will say here only that there are opportunities for creativity and cooperation here that could transform the national debate about endangered species. And finally, I'll remind you again, based on much more than just the Bonneville example that I just used, to look for the prospects of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, suspending the global climate experiment in ways that others will want to copy. The world is full of examples for how you can cut back on your fossil fuels and cripple your local economy. We don't need any more examples like that. The Northwest will be a very different kind of example. And you know, in celebrating that with you today, just before I say my final words, I noted walking in here someone I've always wanted to thank for his contribution in making the Northwest a model for solving the global climate problem, for thinking globally and acting locally. The Northwest Power Planning Council is recognized today as the premier institution, I think, in the country, probably in the world, for helping to identify on a long-term basis the right balance of investment in environmentally responsible energy supply and energy demand. Since its inception in 1981, this rather remarkable regional institution, and again, an example of the kind of regional governance we need to move toward, it's had one executive director, only one. It is unimaginable that it should ever have another. We all owe a debt of gratitude to Ed Sheets, and I get to thank him today on behalf of all of you, and I'm delighted to do it. He's right over there, by the way. Now, I want to close by returning one last time to Mr. Hodel and the way he summed up that vision that was unveiled here 19 years ago. He imagined a whole galaxy of inhabited planets at different stages of development, each seeking technological and social solutions to a common environmental dilemma, meeting the needs of a growing population in a world of limited resources. And now I'm quoting Mr. Hodel, every civilization must go through this. Those that don't make it destroy themselves. Those that do make it wind up cavorting all over the universe. Now, I share Don Hodel's confidence that we're going to make it, although we might still have some trifling disagreements over tactics. And I know that everyone here will help ensure that after all of the cavorting is done, there will still be a Pacific Northwest to come home to. Thank you.
The first question this afternoon will be asked by Tom Stoll.
Ralph, of the list of questions I went over with you, I'm going to pick what I think is the most challenging, and particularly because you ended by talking about Don Hodel's vision of the next 20 years. Tell us your vision of the environmental problems and their solutions for the next 20 years.
One of you will return in 19 years to comment on it, so I do feel challenged by that question. And it's one that is not, I think for the energy future, what I can speak to for the region is to say with confidence there will never be, I don't believe, another coal or nuclear facility constructed to meet the electricity needs of this region, and I think increasingly clear other regions in the country, not because of some obstructionist impulse, but because there are such compelling alternatives. I had a wonderful occasion on Wednesday to just see a symbolic event I never thought I'd see, which is the governor of Oregon and the heads of our three major utilities in the region standing in front of a giant wind turbine blade, pronouncing the dawn of the wind energy age in the Northwest. And I believe it. And I think that will be a part of it. I think we are, the great news on renewable energy, by the way, which many of you have always been taught was 10 years away. And it's been 10 years away as long as any of us can remember. It's here now. It's here now, and I think Rachel Shimshak, who is somewhere in this room from the Renewable Northwest Project, is part of the increasingly obvious presence on the ground of people who know that they can deliver, that they can compete head-to-head with fossil fuels and win. So I think on the electricity side, what we're going to have is a much more energy-efficient economy that essentially makes a transition to renewable power sources. And the utilities that began this revolution that I've described will preside over that, will be a critical part of it. And I believe they'll still be here. There's some people who think utilities are obsolete. I have a view that they can be enormously important contributors to a sustainable future, and their role as managers of the energy resource portfolios that have got to be balanced in order to get us where we need to go. I know there are some of you here with special concerns on the transportation side, where we clearly have, which I have not discussed in detail today, but where, again, the excitement that I feel stems in part from what I know to be going on in terms of really the quantum leaps in technological opportunity in terms of both mass transit and vehicles, where, again, I am optimistic about our capacity to make the transition away from fossil fuels. The fundamental thing that drives this, and the fundamental question, I guess, Tom, that in some ways we have to resolve favorably is can we, I put the question, can we suspend the global climate experiment? Do we have the capacity to do that? Do we have the capacity to stabilize the concentration of gases in the atmosphere that create concerns about global climate? And the answer to that depends vitally on whether we can dramatically reduce over the next half century or so our fossil fuel consumption. I think that's one of the preeminent energy environmental challenges of our time, and my hope is that the speaker who follows me in 19 years will have a lot of very positive stories to tell about our capacity to do that. But we cannot get there unless we can have and resolve productively the kind of regional debate that I mentioned over the Bonneville conservation investment role a few minutes ago. Yes, Doug.
Ralph, I'd like to press you on an issue I know you've had to address a number of times in your career, and that's the issue of litigation as a mechanism for achieving our environmental objectives. A number of the issues you cited, salmon and the forest in the Northwest, have been rocked by litigation. In the case of the forest, it's locked us up. Can you describe from your experience when you decide to use litigation and perhaps some promising examples to avoid it in ways that we can work cooperatively together?
Yeah, I think in the final analysis, look, the litigation almost never solves problems. What it sometimes does is bring a critical group of interest to the table who weren't there before, and who need to be there in order to reach a solution. And I think that in all of the arenas where I've described, ultimately, there were plenty of lawsuits on the energy side. It's important to remember that the energy future of the region was being fought out in the Federal District Court of Oregon 15 years ago, and all of us are glad we got it out of there. But if it hadn't gotten there at one point, it's not clear to me that some of the critical underrepresented interests that mattered in the solution would have been heard. And so I think the challenge always is to focus not just on the case. And the challenge for the people who bring the cases is, what do I do when I win? What do I do if I get, what do I do if in fact the leverage that I'm seeking is conferred, and how do I convert that into a solution that works? And I think something that I have learned, and I think many of my constituents in the environmental community have taught me, is that many of the institutions that are being sued are ultimately going to be critical to solving the problem. And that part of the challenge for people like me is to figure out how to get to the next stage of motivating them to want to solve it, and of working with them to solve it. And we are at different levels of maturity in dealing with the different problems that the region has. But the answer doesn't lie in barring any group, I think, in society from access to the courts. The answer does lie in making sure that all of those stakeholders know, and providing a rich set of examples so that drive the point home, that that's never going to solve it for you. That then, at best, what that's going to do is get you in a position where you can be part of the solution. And nowhere better than here, I think, are we going to see that emerge, and we will see it emerge on all of the fronts that I just described. Other questions from any of you? Sure.
I'm Don Barney, member of the club. You provided us with Don Hodel's version of environmentalist 19 years ago. What would be your profile of the responsible environmental activist today in terms of both protecting the environment but at the same time working through the system at least?
Well, I think that I held up the caricature in part in the hope that it would sound unconvincing to those of you who know and work with environmental activists in the Northwest. And my guess is that it did sound pretty unconvincing. Because what I really learned from my colleagues here, back when I started, was the absolute obligation to have Don is right to say that it's not enough to be against things, but he's right in more arenas than he knows. It's utterly impossible to be politically effective or to matter in the world, I think, if you don't have a plausible and constructive alternative to what you don't like. And so I note that the environmental community 15 years ago, when these great debates were getting underway, was at pains to put a great deal of its effort and resources into developing the alternative and into having a better place for people to jump than the place which the system was taking them. That is, I think, an obligation widely accepted across the spectrum of environmental advocacy. The other thing that I think we've all come to recognize is that many of the institutions that we all saw originally as part of the problem are also a critical part of the solution. And that obviously creates, ultimately, an obligation to figure out what motivates those institutions and to try to help it not simply take those motivations for granted, but to figure out creative ways of changing them. I think it's critical, for example, in thinking about Isaac's future in the utility business, that he not forever be in a company whose profits are chained to how much electricity it sells. And I think that it is important for people like me to recognize that if that's the motivation, a certain set of inescapable conclusions are going to arise, but that we can all work together on looking at whether there are ways of changing the motivation. And having said all that, look, there are going still to be times when it's going to be very important for environmental groups in this region and every other to be loud, noisy, and discordant to get the attention of a system that may be moving in a very bad direction. But that having done that, I think that what we've really established a pretty good track record in this region for doing is getting the solutions. And we ultimately recognize that if we don't get them, and don't get them in a form that others want to copy, we haven't succeeded. Appreciate the question. Anyone else? Yes.
Ray Polanyi, member of the City Club. Mr. Cavanaugh, I'm sorry to say that you almost overlooked a transportation in your survey.
Fire away.
You saved yourself in the last corner there. It happens that transportation is a very important energy sector.
Yes.
Almost 50% of the household energy consumption in the Northwest is for transportation. And Oregon has the dubious distinction of registering more vehicles than living citizens, each using more space than is rational and therefore sustainable. You mentioned Hodel's power plants. I can't escape comparing them to the continued highway expansion that is being still advocated by some.
Okay.
The problem is the lack of alternatives, of course. And here is the question.
Right.
Yes.
Fire away.
I had to frame the question.
It was well framed.
Would you advise Oregon voters to review our very strict constitutional dedication of all gas taxes and registration fees to roads and highways only?
Yes.
And depending on, right. And let me carry that a little further. Would you elaborate, please, on your response?
Well, the fundamental principle that worked on the electricity side was to step back and say, all right, we've got a set of mechanisms for pumping enormous amounts of money into one particular set of solutions to a problem, which is how to provide these electricity services. And we ought to look at ways of making those same investment mechanisms available to lower cost alternatives. I believe Ed Sheets and Dick Watson, his colleague at the Power Council, have written a very interesting paper that he should be required to make available to all of you on the application of those same principles of integrated resource management, as he calls them, to the transportation sector. And the question obviously frames it nicely, because there is now a mechanism for pumping literally billions of dollars into one set of solutions, and one has the sense of a richer array of alternatives waiting in the wings that would benefit from equal access to that investment mechanism. So I would actually recommend that the voters of Oregon do more than just review the question. I'd suggest they answer it. Yes.
Thane Jensen, member of the club. Ralph, you talked about the Pacific Northwest being a place where regional governance can succeed. I'm wondering if you've given some thought as to how we might go about either modifying our existing governmental institutions or creating new institutions to bring about the regional governance that you see that can make sure that we preserve the Pacific Northwest in the light that you feel is possible and desirable.
I'll give at least one answer to that. I think that those who are struggling with the problem of the ecosystem disruptions associated with the Columbia River system are experiencing the particular frustration of trying to deal with that through a set of institutions that either operate by state boundary or at the federal level that have completely independent and not always overlapping jurisdictional mandates. And so how does someone like a Northwest Power Planning Council like Angus Duncan over there deal with the solution of a problem where he's got to deal with Bonneville, the Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, the 4 states? The need for an institution whose authority encompasses the entire ecosystem is, it seems to me, increasingly clear to everyone in this region, and the cost of not having one in terms of this controversy dragging on unproductively is also increasingly clear. And I think we may be nearing a moment of regional consensus not unlike the moment that produced the Northwest Power Planning Council, that says we now have got to together, and we've got to do it as this is a region that does things collectively in really a quite marvelously productive way when it really needs to. I think it's time to initiate the regional discussion. Indeed, I think it has already been initiated on how we will create a Columbia River Basin Authority and how we will empower it to preempt future controversies and very costly problems of this kind. I think we're there now, and I remember many of you remember the debate and the negotiations that ultimately produced the Northwest Power Act. It's hard work, but when there's a clear regional sense of need and I think a shared commitment to solving the problem, we know we can do it. We've done it before, and that's where I think we should begin. Yes.
Yes, I'm Don Wagner, member of the club. And some 20 years ago, shortly after Mr. Hodel had made his remarks, the NRDC produced a document called the NRDC scenario, which was a very well-researched set of alternatives and helped a number of folks kind of talk about it in a different way. Do you have any similar initiatives underway right now, and could you characterize them, if you would?
Well, The NRDC and its colleagues in the Northwest Conservation Act Coalition and the renewable energy work that's going on through Rachel in Portland are very much involved in, I guess, a logical conclusion to that earlier work of helping chart the next couple of decades. There's, I think, special interest now, for example, in the role of the emerging renewable, the second renewable age in the Northwest, the new options that are emerging there, and the new role of energy efficiency with all of the technological changes and the institutional changes that we've seen. I would expect you will see coming out of the NCAC offices in Portland and in Seattle a wealth of new material along those lines, and some of it I think is likely to be unveiled at the shareholders meeting that Sarah will be presiding over in June. So I'd commend all of you with an interest in that, both that you follow that, and if you want to see some of the best work in the region on these issues, that you absolutely join the Northwest Conservation Act Coalition and have access to its biweekly analysis of these issues, which is quite simply the best available anywhere in the region. Sarah will be taking applications at the front of the room. Yes, go ahead.
David Engberg, I'm a member of the City Club. Ralph, you've been leading a coalition of interests in opposition to a concept that's known as retail wheeling, which is the introduction of market forces in the direct supply of electricity at the retail level. And I believe on the grounds that it's neither inevitable nor good for the environment and efficiency in the provision of electric services. I wondered if you're reevaluating that position in light of the decision by the California Public Utility Commission this week to institute retail wheeling in California in the next 2 years.
Well, David has raised an issue which is really about the future of the electric power industry. It's an issue that is more directly engaged in other parts of the country than here, but he's right that it's important to talk about it. And the basic question that is being posed, which David characterized as introducing competition, I want to make clear to all of you that I think the introduction of competition in the electric industry is a reality, and that the debate we're having now is over how to structure it, because competition never occurs in a vacuum, it occurs under certain rules. The fight we're having now, the discussion, is over whether we ought to be recasting the electricity business. I guess the easiest way for me to describe it is as a kind of a commodity exchange. In which the emphasis is on the cost per kilowatt hour, and everything hinges on how cheap the electricity available from a particular supplier is, versus a perspective that says that what's really critical to customers is the energy bill that they pay, and the energy bill reflects both the cost of the kilowatt hours and the energy efficiency of the devices that use the electricity. And here in the Northwest, we've tried to have a balanced emphasis on both minimizing the cost of the electricity and maximizing the efficiency of use. Those who favor a solution called retail wheeling tend to be exclusively focused on the commodity cost. Their argument tends to be electricity is just another commodity, and what we ought to be doing is setting up the rules to get as much of it sold as cheaply as possible. I don't believe that electricity is just another commodity, and I guess that part of my reason for thinking that is because this industry is collectively the most environmentally important in the world. The electric industry accounts for only about 3% of the gross national product of this country. That's, your electric bill collectively is about 3% of the U.S. economy. But electric utilities, the engines that produce it, account for about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide emissions of this economy, about 2/3 of the sulfur dioxide. That's the principal acid rain driver. And as long as you've got an industry that's that significant environmentally, it seems to me that you can't treat it as just another commodity. Justice Brandeis said, I think 60 years ago, that electricity was an industry uniquely affected with a public interest. And I think that that's still true. So the question is, how are we going to resolve this debate? And I will gently remind the questioner that California hasn't instituted this system. California has proposed it. Here as in other contexts, California is not infallible. California has proposed this system and asked for comments. They will get plenty. So far as I know, the California system has not secured the endorsement of a single customer, environmental, user, business organization. It has succeeded remarkably so far in uniting all of them in a healthy skepticism. And my hope is that out of this, I don't think any of us should be afraid of a lively conversation about doing things very differently, which has started in California, but frankly, of course, it started first in the Northwest, as is always the case. The Californians have finally figured it out. Randy Hardy was really describing the central debate that's in the California order when he appeared before you on April 1st. And the most important thing for me to leave with you is this is a discussion, perhaps uniquely, that is a public policy decision that will be made by all of us collectively on public policy grounds. It isn't a decision about technology. It isn't a decision that's driven by some kind of historical imperative. It's a decision that raises serious questions of economic and environmental policy. This is a region that takes those questions seriously. And I know that many of you are going to be actively involved in figuring out where you want this to go. The one thing I want to urge you is when you hear about this, resist the obvious strategy of the advocates for one side, which I've employed many times myself in other contexts, which is to suggest that the result they want is preordained and not susceptible of reasoned discussion or human decision. In this case, I'll acknowledge, and I hope they will, that that's clearly not the case. And I begin with my answer to David's question, I hope a conversation that many of you will be continuing in many other forums, and it's part of what's involved in thinking about where Bonneville should be going also. Yeah.
Dan Goldie, member. I'd like to broaden this discussion out a bit and raise a question with you about the NFRDC and the other environmental organizations' position on world trade.
Okay.
Now, many of them went to court to try to stop NAFTA. I don't remember where NFRDC was.
NRDC supported the treaty.
Supported the treaty.
Yes.
But now that the GATT is up and it's been signed, the new GATT agreement, setting up a World Trade Organization, and it seems that most of the environmental organizations are opposing it. Would you explain what your position is and what you think the environmental group's position ought to be?
On the issue of how to organize international trade is one that has divided the environmental community, and there are people of goodwill on both sides, and I'm going to be the last to claim a doctrinaire certitude on this. But let me tell you about how it evolved. And by the way, this was particularly difficult for me. On the North American Free Trade Agreement, the most eloquent leader of the opposition was my brother, John Cavanaugh, who frequently appeared on C-SPAN, and I think was, if they'd made more use of him, it wouldn't have had a prayer. He was a lot better than Ross Perot, let me assure you. My NRDC's view on the free trade agreement was that in the end, there were built in, and it didn't happen until after the election, environmental safeguards and environmental and by the way, international institutions with sufficient clout. And so, I mean, there's a nice analog of the Northwest Power Planning Council, I might note, in the compliance agreements under the North American Free Trade Agreement. So we were in the end satisfied that sufficient institutional groundwork and safeguards had been created to allow for us to accept the assurances of the sponsors that, in effect, the rising tide lifts all boats in this area. We do see real merit in the proposition that, in general, you've got to get countries out of desperate poverty in order to see many of the kinds of environmental improvements that we desperately need to see. And that was sufficient to get us on board with the free trade agreement. The reason we're not on board with the GATT, the reason none of the environmental groups, as far as I know, have endorsed it, is precisely because there has been no comparable effort to execute side agreements or to create institutional safeguards that are in any way analogous to what was done for the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so on this one, I think I'm allowed to talk to my brother and that we're together, and that that is still a challenge that remains to be met. But I think that obviously with the Free Trade Agreement, there is at least clear precedent that some in the environment, it's not a reflexive opposition. It's an insistence on the creation of the kind of institutional safeguards and the kind of economic incentives that, again, I think are the direct analog of much that I've been discussing today.
Do you have a few questions from the audience here that were sent up? You talked briefly about institutional issues with regard to the Northwest Salmon.
Right.
Would you care to make any comments about what we as individuals or companies can do to help address that problem?
What I'm doing right now, and what I think we all need to be, there are a number of critical stakeholders in this process. I, by the way, disclaim any entitlement to be one. There are people who have devoted their lives to this, who are engaged on the front lines at the moment. I'm an observer like many of you. I think the moment has come for us to begin pressing all of the parties, though, to see if the moment, I think we need to press to see if perhaps the moment has, we've reached the moment when they may be able to hammer some solutions out among themselves. They're obvious. We have gone through the evolution of the engagement through litigation. There is, I think, on all sides a real frustration with that now. My sense in talking to all sides, and it's something that I'm glad to still be able to do, things haven't gotten so polarized that people won't lay out their concerns. My sense is that there's more common ground among the participants than perhaps they realize, and that we may be nearing the point that I very well remember nearing 14 years ago when Tom Stoll stepped in and made the call to Don Frisbee. Somewhere out there, there's a Tom Stoll and a Don Frisbee. I think that one of our collective jobs is to try to find those people and push them into a room together. And then help them, obviously, work through to a solution. The other thing I think we all ought to be doing, and I alluded to it a moment ago, Isaac, is thinking very seriously together about the new kinds of institutions that we need to create in order to deal with what is, after all, a basin-wide problem, and the need to begin anticipating. We don't want to spend the next 20 years with one endangered species listing after another. We really do need to be able to create the kind of institution that can take a global view of a regional watershed and actually begin doing some things that anticipate the problems before they become costly disasters. But what I want to convey is a certain optimism that there is more opportunity for creativity here than perhaps many of us realize so far.
A questioner has asked if you see much of a role in the future for real grassroots activism, and I think the implication from the question was sometimes very confrontational, as being a very critical part of guaranteeing environmental improvements.
Well, I can tell if the national environmental movement loses touch with this very strong popular sentiment around these issues, if it doesn't constantly speak to it, listen to it, and be an effective spokesman for it at least some of the time, we're done. We're dinosaurs. So a fair amount of my time is spent acknowledging I am only as persuasive and only as effective in solving these problems as a grassroots constituency in the Northwest allows me and others like me to be. And if they weren't there, and if there weren't that sense of commitment, which I think you feel stronger and more palpably here in the Northwest than almost anywhere else, then nothing that I'm talking about would matter very much. So I actually am not sure the questioner was, since the word confrontational doesn't appear, let me just supply, the notion that somebody like me better be constantly worried about the constituency is one I absolutely accept, as is the notion that if from time to time a grassroots constituency were not vocally apparent to people making these decisions, these really would be permanently underrepresented interests. They are not interests, remember, that the economic system naturally picks up. So they've got to be picked up in some other way. And to the extent people feel that folks like me have had some constructive role to play, let me be the first to acknowledge that without the mass constituency, the opportunity to play it never arises.
There's been quite a bit of talk about rail, high-speed rail from Vancouver, BC, down to Eugene, Oregon. Would you care to comment on that?
I think only to this extent, that what I learned in the course of working with Ed Sheets and his colleagues in the Power Council and Bonneville and Isaac, your colleagues in the utility sector, is that we are best advised in decisions like this to try to come up with a framework that allows us to winnow out winners and losers on the merits. That one of the great frustrations in the battles over transportation projects is that they tend to sound like classic congressional pork barrel battles, in which particular vocal constituencies line up behind particular big-ticket items, and they want it, and they convey that they want it. But what's missing is an analytical framework that lets you pick the winners and losers on the merits. That was, I think, the great thing that the Power Council gave us, was a way to say, in a situation like that, is that the right investment? Are there less costly ways of delivering equivalent service to the public? And I, again, commend to all of you who are engaged in questions like that the pioneering work that Ed and Dick Watson have done in helping to begin to transfer that kind of a framework to the transportation sector. Because in the final analysis, the role for people, the enduring contribution of people like me is not to pick the winners and losers based on some kind of a gut instinct, but to create a basis on which a much broader society can endorse that result based on criteria that they can understand. And I think we've signally failed to do that on the transportation side to anywhere close to the level we've made it to on the electricity side, and that's one of the challenges of the years immediately ahead, is to just even up the progress there.
One final question. The scientific community is still somewhat undecided on global warming. The National Academy of Sciences has said, however, that there's enough information out there to suggest that it's time to investigate cheap insurance. Could you give us some ideas of what kinds of cheap insurance you think we ought to be investigating?
Sure. Actually, my position on this issue is indistinguishable from that of the Pacific Power and Light Company. Isaac, I'm happy. And it is that I think what Pacific is doing, which I think is a nice model, is Pacific is saying, look, we're not climate scientists. We do not know exactly how this is going to play out, but we are now persuaded that emitting carbon dioxide is a fairly risky thing to do, because there may be future taxes, there may be future emissions limits. Some lunatic like Cavanaugh may get the ear of someone in the federal government, then God knows what will happen. So the strategy that it seems to me results from that is a willingness to begin investing in hedges against those future sources of financial risk. And some of them, which indeed I'm delighted to see Pacific pioneering, include obviously ways of locking up carbon by storing it in the form of trees. I noted in some work that we did for Pacific some years back, actually, that at the time I thought that the best place to store carbon must be in the rainforests. That's what I know. It's the rainforests where the great carbon storage opportunities are, and that is, there are great opportunities there. But per acre, the best carbon storage lands on the face of the earth are in the west side of the Cascades and the Pacific Northwest of the North American continent. And I note that Pacific is beginning to acquire some parcels, and I think that's altogether appropriate. I also think that obviously the other great source of insurance is what I was talking about, which is learning how to aggressively mobilize energy savings opportunities, and the carbon dioxide reductions associated with those savings are just one more good reason for doing something that I think all of the region's utilities are motivated to do in any case. The final thing, and I think the lesson for really all of the institutions in the region that are making decisions about fossil fuels, is just be very cautious about locking in a long-term commitment to something that emits a lot of carbon dioxide. And any large fossil fuel power plant admirably answers that description. So I think that's got to be part of the marketplace in making decisions about where we're taking the region. But again, wherever you are in the global climate debate, and my guess is there are people in this room on all sides of it, it's unfortunately become politicized. We're having advocacy science, which is a bizarre concept for me. But I framed it before as everybody would agree that we're conducting this experiment. There is wide disagreement about the consequences, but if we could suspend it, I think almost all of us would leap at the chance. Thank you.
Ralph, thank you very much. We're adjourned.